Well, good evening, everybody. My name's Ramona Koval, and I'm very excited to be here with you and to be having a conversation with Sir Simon Schama. But before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting today on the traditional lands of the Kulin Nation and to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and to the elders of any other communities who may be with us today. But for now, we're going to sit back and enjoy to be in the great company of Sir Simon Schama, who is University Professor of Art History and History at Columbia University. Of course, you know he's a television writer and presenter of documentaries on art, on history, a writer of a range of large and impressive histories of Britain, of the French Revolution, of the Jews, of the slave trade, of subjects in art. His knighthood is for services to history, but he's written journalism since his student days at Cambridge when he showed what he's described as a precocious knack for hackery.
Who said that?
Simon Schama is master of the big picture, but a lover of small detail, which makes him also a formidable profile writer, as well as a communicator of history and food and theatre and music and politics and almost any version of culture you'd like to name. His new book of essays, which is out the front, is for you to buy later on, and he'll sign it for you. Wordy, sounding off on high art, low appetite and the power of memory. And reading his journalism, you can engage with everything from Mary Quant's 60s fashion to the politics of Brexit, from the giddy black comedy that is the Trump presidency, as he puts it, to the genius of Tom Waits, from Shakespeare to a recipe for rhubarb tart. And he's a master of the Twitter genre too. So
someone has to be. Yeah.
So Simon Schama, welcome to Melbourne.
Hello, Ramona. Thank you.
So reading all of these things, I asked myself, how did he get like that? How did he get so curious with such a range? And you say that your appetite for tales was the legacy of the first practitioners you encountered, your mother and your father, who never stopped telling stories except to eat, sing, argue and sleep. Tell us about Trudy and Arthur.
Yeah, well, they also, the one verb missing from that list, I can't imagine how, is sing. One reason I think when I started talking a lot early was simply, to get a word in edgeways. Actually, believe it or not, there were people who talked more than I did and who sang. But they were in love with show tunes in particular. And there was something really about after the war, I was born in 1945 on a night of a quite serious bombing raid. We bombed Dresden that night, 13th of February 45, but the street I was born in was more or less flattened by V2 rockets. This was not high on Hitler's list of failures, but it was, for me at any rate, a significant one. And there was something about the kind of austerity of the late 40s and early 50s that made my mother and father, being who they were, more than peculiarly splashy, I'd say, both verbally and in pretty much every other way. And breakfast was quite an experience, actually, for myself and my sister.
What happened?
Well, I would be sitting there over something euphemistically called strawberry yogurt, which for some reason I've still, after 70 years, not been able to determine, tasted weirdly like cheese. And or maybe it was me, I don't know. Anyway, but I'm sort of, the fog, and there were real fogs in London then when we moved into London, and on the Thames Estuary, even thicker ones. So I'm getting ready to go to school, and my parents are nowhere to be seen until there were two doors to the kitchen in both houses, actually, both in Westcliff and then in London. And my mother would spring in from one. This was her idea of cheering me up, and begin with a kind of Tuesday morning chorus of Irving Berlin. So it would go, "There's no business-like show," or rather, my mother had a powerful kind of Ethel Merman type voice, At which point, my father would make an entrance on the other side, like no business, I know. And I would go, oh, cheese, strawberry yogurt, fog, I can't do the arithmetic. It would have no effect at all. And so I'd stagger off, really, with this sound ringing in my ears, actually. And there was a sense, actually, that life was sound, I think, actually, even though my father, for a long time, used to, 4 o'clock on Sunday afternoons, he'd read out loud from Dickens, and would insist, quite rightly, because he knew the whole history, that Dickens wrote in a kind of performance mode in his head, which he did, from the even before he started doing it on stage. The Pickwick Papers, in a way, serially published, were kind of performance pieces with lots of funny voices. So there was this extraordinary sense that theatre was for everyone at every possible moment of the day, and that silence was a kind of death amidst life. and this, I think, I'm not sure I do say it in the book. I may say it in the introductory essay, but I took this seriously, so I would do a lot of talking out of turn at school. I held the record at my school for 14 consecutive detentions for talking out of turn. My French teacher, a man called Mr. Pask, who was himself a large, rotund jazz singer of late middle age, who wore fancy, brilliant red French braces, suspenders, so I loved him. He would say, oh, it's the gas bag again. And that was me, and I was
And you've made a living of it.
Yes, and I suspect he thought, for better or worse for the world, that was coming, yeah.
But your dad, he was a bardilator, you said.
He was a bardilator. I should say about Arthur that he wanted to go into the theatre, and his father, absurdly, wanted him to go into the rocky family, inevitably Jewish textile schmutter business. And when my father said, no, I want to go off and produce plays, he thought, and I'm sure he would have been very good at that, he actually his father said, well, if you do that, don't bother coming home again. And my father, I think, was so wounded and stunned by this draconian threat that he thought, okay, I better do this, and maybe thinking he would find a way to be part. And he sort of did and didn't. It was a bitter, deep regret all his life, but he did a lot of amateur theatricals because he had a lot of lovely thespian friends, actors, producers, people like Ralph Richardson, and so he did a lot of that with their willing help. But for him, also, he took very seriously the notion, which is I think a serious issue for our own time, that words out loud could actually sway allegiance, and he was, a soapbox orator against the black shirt fascists in London, beaten up like a lot of people who went up against the fascists in the East End and in central London. He wasn't deterred by that in the slightest. So he once famously said, a Jew's only weapon really is his mouth, which was... so I was also trained by my father, really, to be a kind of a public speaker. And he would stand at the back of the hall and go, louder, which no one has ever really since bothered to say to me. Actually, but he would say that.
So that's why it's called Wordy, this collection of essays, that you are wordy, but you're abundant in being wordy. I mean, that's your gift is that you adore the language that you write in.
Yeah, there is a sort of, I suppose, sort of bewildered greed in my literary appetite, really. I think. I say bewildered in the sense in which I can see and admire every bit as much as everybody else those practitioners of English who specialize in ironic economy. Jane Austen, very obviously, and quite rightly, being at the top. But I talk about this a bit in one of the essays in the book, that when I was growing up, there was something called the New Criticism, which was very powerful and very important. I'm sure you came into contact with that too, Ramona. But so you were taught to read very intensely layers of meaning and unpack them. That was all great. But there was a kind of snobbery, a sort of nose-holding distaste about writers, and they were really, weirdly, Shakespeare was exempt from this, even though a greedier sound merchant artist, you can possibly, if you think about the speeches of, the Falstaff, with whom my father rather identified, and my father actually did, he loved the Mark Antony speech because of the subtlety of the twist, that Mark Antony pretends to be one thing and then in the course of the utterance turns into something else. And so there was the sense when I was growing up in school that really the kind of more exuberant, kind of multifarious style of both writing and speaking was vulgar. Really. It was necessarily less clever, less contained, and therefore less affecting, actually, than the kind of, I wouldn't say drier, though I think in Henry James's case, drier is not necessarily wrong about that. These enormous art, because it didn't have to be short, clipped sentences, the enemy, as it were. They could be very long, endlessly elasticated. There was a fantastic story, which I love, about Henry James, who I kind of like. I wouldn't say I would have his complete works shoveled into my tomb when I croak, but I'm.
Whose works will you have shoveled into your tomb?
John Donne's poems, probably. Yes, John Donne's poems, for sure. A huge amount Shakespeare, for sure. And lots of other rather peculiar. Margaret Yourcenar, who I happen to love, Memoirs of Hadrian. No, Henry James comes back from a day in Cambridge, and someone says, well, how was it? He had lunch at King's College, Cambridge. And so we said, did you have a good time? Yes, he said it was tremendously interesting, but for the fact, he began to construct one of these enormous Gothic cathedral sentences. Tremendously interesting, but for the fact that during lunchtime, I think probably at the first course or possibly during the entree or maybe towards the end, among all the guests who were there, not all of them you understand, but some of them, and one particular man in peculiar, kept on interrupting me by saying, what I think you mean to say is, and completing my sentences. And they said, that's terrible. Who was this person? I said, I know, he was called Keynes or something. So it was wonderful.
So writing history and writing journalism, did journalism, it must have meant that you had to be briefer than you were inclined to be.
Have you read my journalism?
Yes, I have. But, it doesn't, you get...
Briefer, yeah.
It is briefer.
Yes. No, actually,
but you've been really
on...
lucky. You've been allowed to go on and on.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I have as I say, I'm very grateful to my editors at the Financial Times. Now, I always loved journalism. It's very interesting, actually, at Cambridge when I was a student, there simply wasn't enough time to do both debating and journalism. And actually, I kind of plumped for... I remember going into the Cambridge Union. I did speak at the Union a bit. And I was always given the kind of comedy roles, which in retrospect is possibly a good thing. But I remember going in, and it was 1963, and went in, and there's this tall, tweedy person, I hope not related to anyone here, who simply began his welcome speech to men, as he said, it didn't occur to him that women might be there too, which they were, and said, good morning, men, my name is Weaver, Oliver Weaver. And there was something about that poisoned comma between Weaver, Oliver Weaver, that I thought, I hate you already, so off to journalism I went. And I was
Sometimes
indulged.
It's the little things, isn't it?
Yeah, but the moment I really did have to rethink how the journalism went was when Tina Brown very kindly made me, or rashly, art critic for The New Yorker in 1995. And I did actually repay her in the worst possible way, because I wanted to do a piece, I wanted to be outside my comfort zone before she really said yes, and I really said yes. I wrote a piece about Mondrian. And it was much too long, in fact. After that, it was such a regular beat, and I wanted it, partly because actually I was always being told about Harold Rosenberg and Clement Greenberg, not in New Yorker, and these great kind of cardinal-like figures who adumbrated a kind of philosophy of art. I thought, no, people actually wanted a kind of quicker, sharper, more inviting experience, really. So being nimble was the thing, not at the expense of the complexity of the art or the problems the art might set you. So I did kind of develop, I was quite proud of doing that, a slightly happy-go-lucky, sharp, short, punchy style for that.
And your friend Robert Hughes gave you some
Yes,
advice
Bob
about...
gave me, yes,
what did he say?
we were very good friends. Bob, because I was very nervous because Bob was already a friend. I thought, well, he's not going to think, you know, I don't know. I thought of Bob. I mixed him up with a very daunting Rembrandt self-portrait, which is always in the Frick Museum, where Rembrandt has just been bankrupted at 1658, and instead of painting a kind of apologetic self-portrait, he paints himself in glorious majesty enthroned with a silver-topped mahlstick. And every time I went yet again and filmed that, I could always hear Rembrandt saying, I've seen people like you before, Sonny Jim. You know, sod off, really. And I thought that's kind of what Bob would feel about me presuming to join the ranks of the art critics, and there was nobody better than Bob. But he didn't. He was wonderfully generous and encouraging. But he said, okay, he said, never go to art openings. He said it's just a lot of, and he used a Hughesian profanity, which in Australia, he said, they're just a lot of wankers. You know,
Yeah.
so he actually said wankers with white wine, actually. I think it would have been, which is kind of, it is true. Why, you know, you can't get red wine in case someone throws it at the Picasso or something. As if white wine would do no damage at all. So he said, don't go to openings. And he said, either go when the show's being installed or go with the public. And he was absolutely right about that, actually. I remember one of the early shows I went to was a show in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, a wonderful Cézanne show. And my kind of peers and colleagues in the craft were going around with the acoustic guide on their head. I thought, you know, maybe you're listening to punk rock, but I doubt it, actually, you know, when they were doing this. So, yeah, that was very good advice.
So they weren't getting their own experience of the work.
No, and I do think art journalism it's a special thing, and you have to develop your own, as I say, voice, really. Bob was an incredible thing for Time magazine, and he was really devastated, actually, when they decided they didn't need an art critic, and yeah.
Well, we talked about wine, but what about food? Because I was surprised to learn that you're not just a wordy, you're a foodie, you're a cook, you're an eater, and you're a writer about food.
Yeah. Yes, I was the cookery writer for GQ magazine in Britain for years, actually. And then it became very complicated because of the photo shoots and so on.
Why? What happened with the photo shoots?
My wife's here, she'll bear me out. And I used to get very bad-tempered because not in the cooking. I used to cook something, then I used to take phone photos. I can't remember when I started, it was about 10 years ago I started. And I used to send a phone photo saying, this is what it should look like in the, it's a glossy magazine.
Well, it should look like what I've done here.
Absolutely. So I alone would take the blame if the recipe went wrong. And it never did. And there was one really catastrophic experience. It was a pistachio tart, everybody, which is not actually hard to make. It's like an almond tart. But there is a particular kind of pistachio, which is in a rather snooty way, called Bronte pistachios. And they're screamingly green. They're kind of Irishly made up, but they're very, very intense. And they only grow on the slopes of Mount Etna. They're I know. Yeah, not all the recipes were as stupid as this, but they are very intensely flavored, and they're this gorgeous color, so I duly made it, and it worked out well. And they're quite expensive, these pistachios, but they also come pre-blanched, so you don't have to, if you've ever used pistachios to make ice cream, or it's an incredibly finicky and soul-destroying issue because you have to blanch them and get the skins off and then dry them out and everything. You don't want to waste your life doing that. So I made this tart, and I was very happy, and sent it off. And the proof of the picture came back, and it looked just like kind of mud. It looked like kind of mud pie, you know, that sort of dark, sort of almost olivey colour, which is sort of what you want to see if you're, you know, using pistachio in a savoury dish or indeed in ice cream. And I said, no, it's got to be much more vivid. So then the thing came back, and it was like bloody AstroTurf. It was like sort of someone had gone around spraying the tart with herbicide, you know. And I thought,
very
no.
appetising.
Yeah. So I thought, no, I can't get everything else. I've got to actually do the food photography on the spot, not take the pictures. But I found this fantastic photographer in London called Romas, who was really a kind of partner in all this. And things could go wrong, there was even then. And it was wonderful, and then we did, and then it was all okay, but it was a very, very complicated setup. There's a recipe for ultimate chili, which I'm quite proud of. Sort of complicated recipe, different kinds of dried chili, but it's a good one. And it involves, if you're doing it right, pan roasting some of them. So they give off a little bit of smoke, and before, that is, you soak them. It's kind of weird double hot and cold way to prepare the chili peppers, not using pre-done powder. What I didn't know was above our kitchen studio, which is in the basement, Romas's wife was giving yoga classes, and there was this terrible, suddenly in the middle of this, choking, wailing, and screaming noise, really, as the yoga class were being basically attacked where it counted. And there was no sign of Namaste to be anywhere. And she basically booted me and her husband out. And so it became a very complicated thing. But I've been interested in, you know, eating and talking are two of the things we do with our tongue. And that ever since, Lucullus, you know, but certainly since the first cookery books, the first one in English, it's in the reign of Richard II's, purporting to be the king's own cookery book. That may have been why he was deposed, of course. Sort of Nancy Boy King in the kitchen, you know, or not. There's been this sort of, you know, interesting thought, really, about what it is to actually whet someone's appetite with mere words, actually, and there are some. How many of you have heard of MFK Fisher? Ramona, well, I mean, so some of you, that's great, who's an American woman writer about food, and is thought of as a cookery writer, but as you know, she's really a writer about life, about love and desire and pain and poverty and so on, which all takes the form. MFK Fisher's recipes aren't that hot, in fact, as you must know, but the writing is some of the most beautiful writing in American English in the entire 20th century, in my view, actually. And so there's one, my favorite essay, which I talk about, I think, not in this book, in an earlier book of essays. She's with her first husband in the 1930s in Nancy, in Lorraine, in eastern France on the border, and therefore a very, you know, nervous kind of place in the 30s, as to particularly, it was just before the German reoccupation of the Rhineland. And he goes off to teach. Al goes off to teach, and she wants to do something special for him. She's sitting by the window looking at the kind of, the milice, the kind of militia soldiers drilling in what she knows already. Fatefully, it's going to be a hopeless exercise. And she does something unbelievably simple. And she takes a single tangerine, and she parts the segments so that, you know how easy it is, so the tangerine remains intact. And she puts it on a newspaper, which sounds not good, but obviously was good, and puts the tangerine on the newspaper on a radiator, on an old-fashioned radiator, so that the scent of the fruit then actually fills the room. And she describes this as a kind of special secret treasure she's prepared for her lovely husband. And he comes back, and then she describes, and I will not even attempt to paraphrase it because it would be a crime to get it wrong, but she describes the moment where your teeth break the membrane of one of those tangerine segments, and a little flood of cold juice, even if it's been on the warm paper, fills the mouth. That's X-rated stuff,
It's
really.
sexy, very sexy.
And isn't it wonderful?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I admire many writers who've been fantastic at food writing.
Well, your description of that tart reminded me that I wanted to talk to you about colour and getting the colour right. And one of the most lovely essays in this book is about the Forbes collection of pigments and colours at Harvard University. Can you describe this place and what it has in it?
Yes, it's amazing. Forbes was himself a director of the Harvard Art Museum. I taught at Harvard, and I taught, to my great happiness, art history, rather more than I taught history, in fact, actually. And I knew about this collection, but didn't know what it was. And it is a collection of pigments, the material basis for different paint colours, and hundreds of them. And some of them are very old indeed. There's one extraordinary one called Mummy Brown, which was literally made from the gunk of decomposing mummies. There was a trade in this from the 17th century onwards, which is documented. And you will never know. And there was a surviving little skin. I think actually all that time ago they were contained in bladders. We know they were certainly made up that way for artists. And there is a surviving skin of it just before the conversion of paint containers to metal tubes in the late 19th century. So one could conceivably, but it was thought to be the kind of meatiest brown and the most durable brown. But a lot of it, I think, was really, just believed to be the case because of the fabulously weird and esoteric source of this, and people became more and more horrified by the fact that you were essentially daubing on the remains of some ancient cadaver, really, which was not a good thing to do. So they had lots and lots of these strange things that had been abandoned, a very raw form of cinnabar, which makes a kind of very dusky kind of red, which is deeply poisonous. And so it's a kind of incredible chamber.
And the Indian yellow.
Indian yellow. A lot of the articles about Indian yellow. So Indian yellow, which is a very intense yellow, was said to be that way because it was made from the urine of buffaloes or cows in one particular area of India that had been fed exclusively on mango leaves. And yeah, I know, not on the fruit, but on the leaves. So there was some sort of connection, actually, between the foliage and the intensity. But it meant that these animals were actually, they were made to go hopping around in agony before their urine could be, as the British authorities said, euphemistically milked, actually, for this particular trade. So this was so bizarre that somebody actually who was running the botanical gardens at Kew in the 19th century thought actually to have an official determination because it was cruel to the animals, and also it seemed to be too, wildly, almost comical to be actually true. And it took a long time before it was discovered. Well, it was actually been dismissed for many, many years as a fairy tale and not true, and a kind of, typical horror the kind of British would dream up, both to kind of condescend to the natives who were supposed to be engaging in this and to congratulate themselves for ending this trade. And then just a very few years ago, surviving samples of Indian yellow were analyzed by teams of scientists in America who, lo and behold, found that it was entirely true. Don't all rush out, and there's not a whole lot of supply out there. But
you say the sheer labour that had went into getting a colour that was absolutely right.
Yes.
For people to use.
I think colour has actually been part of many different kinds of worlds that we're not quite aware of. When I made in Civilizations, I made a film just entirely about colour, slightly to the consternation of the producers, and because one of the things I knew was the case, we know a lot about Greek sculpture not being this, beautiful, elegant colourlessness, which is supposed to intensify the grace of the form, but actually being kind of, Disneyland quality, screaming reds, scarlets, blues, and greens. The same, of course, understanding was true for some of them, it's not all of them, but some of the most beautiful cathedrals, Gothic cathedrals in France, Amiens Cathedral in particular. We know from all sorts of surviving pigment flake that a lot of the statuary in the west facade, the main facade of Amiens Cathedral, it's true of Beauvais as well, were just dazzlingly, mind-blowingly coloured. So a very clever company specialising in projections of colour, because you don't want to plaster the surviving statuary with modern paint again, does the most amazing light show, which we then film. So I think, colour, I suppose actually it's very interesting. In the Renaissance, there's a big debate about whether or not line or colour, they shouldn't, of course, be mutually contradictory. But it was typical that Leon Battista Alberti and people like him thought that because they were so in love with the classical statuary that was being discovered almost every week, really, in 15th and 16th century Rome, and some in Tuscany as well, that essentially line was majestic and noble. It's a bit like the kind of Austen versus, Dickens over-the-topishness. And colour was a kind of cheap and gaudy ingratiation of the senses. In other words, it's what artists in Venice did, because they'd been corrupted by the Orient in particular, by the Turks and so on, so that they were gaudy merchants of an instant hit of pleasure. And we Tuscans, we don't do that. We read ancient texts and and essentially sculpture is the default mode. And then if we get sculpture right, it's actually untrue about a lot. Obviously, Giotto was, extraordinary colorist. Fra Angelico used lapis lazuli, intensely. But there was a line. Michelangelo used to describe the colour effects of northern Flemish artists as being very good for painters who normally specialised in things like grass and trees and so on. It was the most incredible put down. But Michelangelo, of course, as we know from the cleaning of the Sistine Chapel, then became the colourist of almost acid trip wildness, actually, but only at the very end of his life. So this whole issue of... And I'll tell you just one other thing, Ramona, that, when you do make these films, you have to be... It was very funny, this particular program on colour I made with a brilliant director I've worked with in The Story of the Jews, Hugo McGregor. And I said, we just want to make a film. Let's go from medieval cathedrals and end with another blaze of colour in Matisse's beautiful chapel in the south of France, in Saint-Paul-de-Vence. And he said, and only when we were sort of way into the production, I thought, what is it I've forgotten about Hugo? I know, he's colorblind, actually, which is true. And he knows, this is a different color from that one, but I think it's purple, he says to me. I say, yeah, it is. And so he couldn't do the absolute all-important issue of color grading, which is what you do in the edit. And I'm a bit, as I get into what someone called the springtime of senility, the more fierce I am and control freaky about actually doing the color grade. But then the crucial point is, you're amazed I've got there, is... The crucial point is, what are you grading against, actually? And because you're not sitting in the National Gallery of Victoria, where I went today, very happily, you're not sitting in a museum. So you're certainly not grading it against a reproduction of it on paper. You're not grading it against a digital reproduction online, because who knows what they were grading, to kind of calibrate finally the intent, the saturation of colors. So you actually end up saying, well, I'm actually grading against my most recent memory of the Night Watch or of a Giovanni Bellini altarpiece. And you're aware that this is a mystery and a trap and a danger.
But it's your film.
But it sort of is your film, and you just try, and it embarrassingly comes down to some subjective hunch. Actually, it's very interesting when you actually, it's not quite as random as that. I'm making it sound more random, because actually, we were grading, I remember, and had to be right, an altarpiece in San Zaccaria, the Church of San Zaccaria, so-called Sacra Conversazione, extraordinary thing, where Giovanni Bellini, as the first person really to be an unapologetic, wild colorist, it has to be a perfect, absolutely perfect blue and a perfect green, you need to get that right. And the adjacence between the colors, really, the way they actually fit together or don't fit together. The Dutch in the 17th century had a wonderful word, houding, which really means the locking together of different optical values. Will tell you, in a way, actually, whether you've overdone the saturation or underdone the saturation. So you have these, even so, it's a very imperfect craft.
You are a profile writer too, and you've done this bit quite a lot that I'm doing now.
Yes, I'm doing one of you, actually. Didn't I tell you that, actually?
So you're a keen observer of people, I notice, in your profiles.
Yeah.
Are you sneaky with them?
Incredibly, yes.
What are you sneaky
No,
about?
I don't believe they're all those. No, I'm not. I don't do the ones. I mean, there have been profiles of me that said Simon Schama, marched into this sort of Roman hotel where we were, looking like yesterday's dish rag or something like that.
Unkind.
Yeah, no, but it's, it sells copies of magazines or papers. So, no, I don't do that. And but there are certain things that, yes, you sort of look for in an almost kind of amateur detective way, really. That help you. I don't think you do this if you're doing your job properly. You certainly don't do it in a kind of snarky sense, really.
But you want hints about where you might find
yes, I mean, for example, the piece on Patti Smith, who is absolutely, I mean, scary to look at before you know her, but she, has a dramatically unfilm star-like face, really. But she has the gentlest manner and is a kind of tremendously brainy swat. But then at the beginning, and she came in, in standard kind of pop star black, really. And she spent a lot of time kind of apologizing for how casual she was looking. And I thought that was incredibly endearing. I wasn't exactly looking like David Bowie myself, at that particular moment, more the dish rag style. And I thought, wow, you have such a dramatic persona, actually. And, this powerful beaky nose and his flashing dark eyes and this beautiful voice. Hers is a voice, although she says that her voice has been corrupted slightly and changed. She didn't say it to me, but more recently she said this, but you don't notice it, actually, I think, in anything she sings particularly. So, but yes, you do. There was, sometimes it is a matter of being a bit on your guard. I did interview with Bill Clinton, and he's kind of almost Machiavellian in his charm, but I knew that already.
You were on your guard, were you?
Yeah, there are moments where you don't get much kind of space between you, and it's a bit worrying. And it is simply a charm tactic. But I remembered, actually, I went to, when he was president, And I went to a friend of mine, great historian Natalie Davis, was giving the Jefferson Lecture in the White House, and I went. And it was a small-ish gathering, 40 or 50 people. And there was a kind of buffet party afterwards. It was very nice. And I was actually talking to Hillary, and I was sort of complaining there. Chelsea was at school then about, history not being allowed to be called history, the discipline. No, in America it's called social studies.
Really?
Yes, I mean, 2 words designed to send a class to sleep before they've ever opened a book. And so she said, well, go and complain about it to my husband, why don't you? So I thought, okay, so I joined the little line. And he was very nice, and he said, yes, you're quite right, history should be, out there. And then I went.
It?
Pardon?
Did he fix it?
Of course not. No, actually, no. Impossible. Education's down on local power basis. But I was about to then go back to, the kind of mushroom vol au vents. And as I was sort of turned, an arm was round my shoulder. So I then had to turn back to him. And then, almost at kissing distance, he said, Simon, it's just wonderful that you came this evening. And I thought, what would you like me to do for you? Anything sort of short of, So I understand Monica Lewinsky perfectly.
Gee,
I didn't go there.
I was going to mention Monica, but I thought better of
I
it.
didn't go
But
there.
I'm glad you did.
No, I really didn't. But it was kind of just absolutely, wickedly charming, really. So, yeah.
I've got about 3 ways I want to go here with 3 different questions.
All of them dangerous. Yeah.
No. Just on the question of colour and interviewing artists.
Right.
And sometimes they can be very difficult to interview. But you say that they're always kind of interested in the materials. They will talk about the materials.
Yes, they do. You start with technique and the objects, and rather than not many of the ones who I did do profiles of and are in the book, like Cindy Sherman and Tasta Dean and Rachel White-Reed. They all have their philosophies of why they're doing what they're doing, but they really it helps actually to talk about. Going to Cindy Sherman's studio on the west side of New York, and it's like going into a kind of the most glorious and extraordinary department store of come museum of clothing over the last 50 years. So you talk about the dresses and the outfits and the prosthetic bits and pieces that are there, and they're happy to do that. But there are of course artists who specialize in laconic destruction of the confidence of the interviewer. I mean, and if I talk about the Hodgkin thing,
you do.
I do. Shall I say a word about that?
Do you want to?
Well, it was really it was the worst interview. It was an on-stage interview, and I knew Howard Hodgkin. I don't know how many of you know his work. He died a few years ago. Yeah, it's the same people who know MFK Fishers. Why am I starting to get suspicious about the clever swats in the class here? Well, Howard did these extraordinarily, brilliantly colourful, abstract versions of memories and room interiors and views out windows, and that you can barely see the ostensible subject matter. What you do see is this roaring blaze of thickly applied paint. And Howard and I happened to be at Oxford College. I was a young Don, and he was an artist in residence. So we knew each other a bit, and we talked painting.
I'm shocked that you knew each other, because
really?
I'm shocked that he behaved like that when you knew each other.
Well, yeah, me too.
Say what he did.
No, me too, because it was kind of worse than that in a way, because actually we used to meet, I don't know, once a year maybe, and have lunch. He used to come to New York sometimes, and we'd talk about Turner and so on. And so he phoned me up and said, they want me to do a conversation with someone. So I thought of you, and I said, I'd be absolutely honoured. Howard was, and then we left it at that. And then a few weeks before the event, I phoned him up and said, look, I'm sure everybody knows your work, certainly the 8 people at the front of this audience. But for all those who don't, let's pick 2 or 3, just 2 or 3 slides, and we can talk around them. And in Howard's voice at the other end of the phone, he said, absolutely not. And I thought, this might not work out well. And we met, but I didn't do anything about it. And we met behind about to go on stage. And he was chatty, and we went on stage. And I said confidently, so Howard, the first thing that everybody who loves your work, and everybody does, think about is the color. And he said, is it? And he stopped at that, actually. And I saw at that moment, there was this big hay on wye in these big tents. There's a kind of clock like the one we got there. And the hands froze at that point. And I felt they were starting to move backwards. And so I wittered on a bit. I was starting to perspire. It was a kind of sweaty day. And then I said, well, you yourself have said that. And I memorized something he was on record saying, that every painting you do is a memory. And he said, did I say that? He said, I can't remember if I did. And everybody laughed. He hadn't meant it as a joke, but everybody laughed, And at that point, the hands of the clock did start to go backwards. And I could feel the audience was dividing into a large number of people who disgracefully were enjoying the meltdown of Schama, and we're going, yay, about time too, cocky sod, and as if they were watching a bad production of Harold Pinter play or a good production of Waiting for Godot or something. And then there were a few later on who couldn't wait to buy me a drink afterwards. And at the end of it all, being a nice person, I made a little 5-minute speech about, at one point it got so desperate, I said, oh, Howard, let's talk about football. And he said, why would we do that,
And
so at the end, I made a speech.
Did you maintain your friendship with him?
No.
I wouldn't.
No, well, you were right, and I didn't.
Unforgivable.
It was particularly because at the end, I gave a little speech about why everybody should love his work, which is true. And when we got off stage, he said, well, that was the most extraordinary tribute, At that point, I wanted to smash his brains on the nearest concrete beam, really, and
It's a big lesson about dividing the work from the writer, the artist, the whatever. You have to do it, don't you?
But there are an extraordinary, at the other end, there are an amazing number. It's a sort of power play. You remember, people used to say to John Lennon, oh, John, Ellis, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. Oh, LSD. And Dylan does this as well. And John Lennon would say, well, you tell me if you think that's right, it must be so. And it's just a complete power play. And but there are a lot of artists who are very incredibly eloquent and smart, and they expect you to have done the homework and be engaged, and they don't want you to gush particularly. There are a surprising number, actually, who do that.
And you call it a hospitality?
Yes, it's a kind of hospitality, yeah.
Can historians ever be optimists, given that they know so much about what has happened?
Yeah, what a great question. It's a struggle. I think, actually, that it's as characteristic of historians to be constantly astonished by human vitality and creativity and the ability of humans to understand predicament or survive wars and so on, as they are knowing about the next impending calamity. But it's true that there is something, Western history, which is not the only history there is, but Western history is, begins kind of with Thucydides, maybe with Herodotus. And Thucydides is very dark because he had the correct instinct that the danger for history is it's a form of self-congratulation. If it's just about the genealogy of why we turned out so wonderful in our present age, it is actually sort of, self-neutering in a way, it's not. And historians' job is to be a gadflies, to actually, I always describe it, we have an obligation to make people insomniac, really, to worry. And that's why it's very easy to be Jewish and a historian, really. So my favorite Jewish joke is the shortest one. Do you know this one, Ramona?
I know this one.
Can I say it anyway?
Because
maybe it's possible. So it's a waiter who comes over to Mrs. Cohen, who's had the same thing for the last 50 years, and just leans over and says, is anything all right? You know, that's kind of...
Well, look, now I'm going to take some questions. You have to line up in an orderly fashion. Make sure you have an actual question, not too long. Make it pithy and perfect, or else. Go.
Hi, Simon. This is my perfect
Hello.
question.
Yeah, hi.
Historian Antonia Fraser was criticised for her proposed biography of Proust because she wasn't French, she wasn't a man, and she wasn't gay.
Right.
So I was wondering if you'd care to comment on if identity politics and history make strange bedfellows.
Yeah, I think thank you for that question. Very of the time now, alas. And no, I'm bitterly against the obligations of identity politics in writing history and in some other respects as well. Again, to go back to the other founder in the Western tradition, Herodotus. What is striking about Herodotus' account of the wars with the Persians is how incredibly interested in the Persians he is. That book is a kind of ethnography, in a way, of what Persian culture and religion is like. It wasn't just simply a kind of an account of by the victors of the vanquished. And there's a huge section of it about Egypt, which really has nothing to do with the main line of the story. And I only say that to you. What's your name, firstly?
Declan.
Declan? Yes. I only say this to you, Declan, because actually, for me at any rate, the appeal of history, its great drive, is that you live with other people, with people who are not like you, who are removed from you in both space and time. At least that's history I've always wanted to do. It was weird in a way. It took a long time to come back to Jewish history, my own first historical culture from reading the Bible, kind of because I really wanted to be in cultures with which I did not have a native relationship, the Dutch, the French, for example. And the sort of, if we think about the three profound problems of our time now, the overwhelming problem is the collapse of the ecologically sustainable planet, the growing inequality between rich and poor countries, developing and developed countries, and thirdly, and they're all connected actually, I think, the third is the bitter division between people who only want to live next to people who look, sound, pray, cook, sing like them, and have same color skin, and those who kind of welcome, as it were, a mixed neighborhood. And there is something about doing history which pulls you into a mixed neighborhood, I think, not to make it sound too heroic. There are plenty of people who do want to do the origins of us, but that's not been the case for me. So I think it is really, it's a profound loss if only people from within some sort of cultural tradition are entitled to write about that cultural tradition. We were talking about this, and I don't see why I should be discreet at all. It would in fact shock all of you if I suddenly became so. But this series of television, which some of you may see, the BBC version was broadcast in Australia, I'm very glad to say, called Civilizations with a plural, was part of what it wanted to do was to actually open up that great narrative line in Kenneth Clark's series to think and speak and look at Chinese landscapes and, in my case, Mughal architecture and Mughal miniatures as well, all sorts of African art and so on. PBS, our American co-producers, were so terrified, actually, of the identity culture police, as I think of them, that what they, when I do discuss Chinese landscape, it was obligatory for them to produce somebody who was authentically Chinese in order to comment on what I've been saying. So this is a kind of form of corrupt cowardice, in my view, and actually makes us all, if we're all going to retreat within our own citadels, we're going to be in deep trouble, I think.
Yes,
Good evening, Simon.
Hello.
You mentioned that you visited the National Gallery Victoria.
I did today. Not the
Yes.
first visit, but
Good.
it's changed a lot. It's beautiful.
Good.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you visited any of the Australian galleries and if you have any opinions on some of our own Melbourne painters of old that you'd like to share.
Oh,
Like-
wow, no, not yet. I only got here yesterday, mate, so...
Okay. Even so, perhaps
Is
if...
this a short question? Because I'm going to get very serious.
Yeah, no, I don't know. You'd have to educate me about Melbourne. Yeah, we went
I'm
to...
literally
when we-
just interested if you have any opinions on some of our painters of old, like Robert Street and McCubbin, whom your friend Rob Hughes started out writing about, if you have any impressions of them.
Yes, well, Cameron I like a lot. And, I'd rather have a thing about Arthur Boyd, who this may be a weird preference, but I like the kind of fantastical element, actually, in what he does. I do love Aboriginal art, and there's the museum in Sydney we went to some years ago, I think it was a long time ago now, and that was kind of overwhelming experience, really. It would be... what I do not want to do is pretend to be eloquent in an area where I've no right to be yet. So I have everything to learn, and I fully expect you to teach me, and look forward to that.
Great to listen to you tonight and your very interesting perspectives. I really loved your series, The History of Britain, which is quite a few years old now.
Where are you? Sorry,
up
just
in the gods.
are you up
Up
in
here.
it? Okay.
Up
You're
here.
not spotlit.
No,
We're
up
just-
there.
That's unfair.
At the very top to your left.
Okay.
And up.
Wow. Oh, there you are. Oh, my God.
Yes.
Well, that is so scary. Don't jump.
Yes.
I promise I'll be done soon. Don't. Hello.
My question is that in your series History of Britain, you weaved a wonderful narrative about the progress of United Kingdom and its struggle to find a place in Europe. Taking the long view, how do you see which is happening around Brexit? How do you see that in terms of that longer term narrative about the story of Britain?
Well, it's a very good question, a very difficult one to answer, because Brexit has become a kind of an ordeal, and it was always destined, I think, to turn into a kind of... I don't necessarily think I knew how bitter the argument would be, and it's taking place all over the world, really, but an argument about who we are, what the identity of a country is, and... there was that famous Dean Acheson line from the 1950s when he said Britain's lost an empire and hasn't found a role yet. And that still remains somewhat true. It was, in my generation growing up in the 1950s and 1960s, kind of assumed, rather complacently, that the days of a kind of defensively tribal, embattled feeling, particularly about generations of immigrants, the Windrush generation from the Caribbean, generation of Kenyan, Ugandan Asians, for example, who were thrown out of Idi Amin's Uganda, large populations from South Asia. As I was growing up, I don't think I posed the question to myself, well, is there going to be a long-term problem about how British they are seen to be or how not British they are seen to be? And the oddity, I think, has been that that has come to be a kind of profound and divisive and abrasive issue. And you clearly know quite something about Brexit. What is very striking, I suppose it is in a way, one of the few notes not to despair about it. It's exactly in those big urban centres, not just London, where most people of immigrant background, second or third generation, but the few of them still first generation, live, like Manchester and Liverpool and Edinburgh and Glasgow, where there are largest immigrant populations. The vote against Brexit was strongest. In other words, the kind of anti-xenophobic, anti-chauvinist vote was strongest. But it's sort of, we have there was a wonderful moment, I thought. No mayor of London is ever going to be perfect, but we have the son of a Pakistani origin bus driver, Sadiq Khan, as our mayor, and he went for a visit to Pakistan, and someone said to him, "Welcome home, Mr. Khan." And he said, "I'm from South London," and it was sort of a wonderful moment because he was there and he was embracing the place his family had come from, but the assumption was, "I'm a Londoner, mate, get used to it," and this is how. So this is sort of happening. It's happening, in France as well. It's happening in Italy. It's happening in other countries. And it is to do with the fact of not spelling out really clearly enough what the problems or what the positive opportunities are of the blowback of empire, really, of what happens. The assumption, again, not to do a long professorial lecture about it, the assumption always was that because there was a certain amount, you'll know this in Australia, of indecent and unearned self-congratulation. We've left India, we've left Ghana, and so on, but they all have, quote, Westminster democracies or something, that they all play cricket, and nothing wrong with that, Australia, of course. And therefore, in some sense, we've made our mark on, and that therefore, their own culture and their own sense of cultural identity would never be strong enough to actually, raise the hackles of someone who might be frightened of that, actually. So that whole conversation was never got into, I think, really. And then nobody really saw the coming of fundamentalist Islam, which is not really a problem except in tiny numbers in a country like Britain, but is perceived to be, the tidal wave of Sharia law just round the corner in an absolutely paranoid way. What we're seeing, really, not just in Britain, and I won't say anything about Australia, is the sort of weaponization of a kind of paranoia about strangers in our midst, actually. And this is an awful thing. Eventually, we were saying before, the top issue of that list of profound crises, namely the slow death of the planet, it will not stop really with fences and walls and barriers. It's something which in the long run is absolutely going to, whether we like it or not, bring us together. And there are particular micro-ecological crises which have caused a great rush of human migration of the kind that one saw, the long centuries of Roman decline. Just one example, I'll give you an example I know a bit about because I'm closely involved with them. The terrible droughts visited on the upper valley of the Euphrates River made it impossible for young men in southeastern Lebanon and southwestern Syria to go into an agrarian. The agrarian economy just shriveled and died in a large area, and there was nothing for it but for these young men to go to Homs and Aleppo and Damascus. I'm talking about 10 years ago now, where there was no real work for them, and to be absolutely, join a pool of recruitment for both sides of the Syrian civil war. That's just one tiny example. Another example would be the collapse of coffee growing in Central America, which is partly along with crime and local domestic terrifying circumstances of violence in countries like Honduras and Guatemala, led to these sort of tragic trains of families of children and mothers up towards the American border. So this is, you've put your finger in a way, just by talking about Britain, you've put your finger on a kind of profound matter that historians really do need to take on more, I think, and not be frightened of.
Well, I can't believe that we can't sit here for another 3 more hours, but we
Look
can't.
at it, it's actually going red alert, red. No. Like, if we sat here and talked, with the Athenaeum cops,
I think they'd get one of
cops
those-
come and get us and shut him up.
Look, they've turned the lights
Just try it, right? Just try it. They turn the lights out. You know, it's like pub closing time.
on. You know, if you go out to the foyer, you'll be able to buy some Sir Simon books, and he'll sign them for you. And he might even say a few words to you then. But I've enjoyed being up here on the stage. I hope you've enjoyed being there. Please thank Sir Simon for being so lovely.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.